You're listening to the Talking Headways podcast network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're listening in on a one-to-one conversation between HNTB's Julie Eaton Ernst and Cris Liban, Sustainability Officer for LA Metro. They chat about the co-benefits of transportation, the evolution of the definition of transportation, and making change in small steps. Stay with us. Today's podcast was produced in partnership with Impact. For a deeper dive on livability and transportation issues, or to find out more about the annual conference next year in Portland, Oregon, visit impactmobility.org. That's impactmobility.org. Hey everybody. This week's podcast, as always, is sponsored by our super generous Patreon supporters. Thanks so much for sponsoring and supporting this show and our Monday shows. We really appreciate you all for keeping this thing going. To join our merry band of supporters, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month and you'll get some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month and you'll get one of our bus-only scarves. We've also started posting a few bonus materials for all supporters, including extended audio from shows like our recent episode with Jillian Gillette. I know that there's a free version now, and I've set it so that the free version comes up maybe like a few weeks late. So if you sign up for our free version of Patreon, which I guess exists now, check that out too. Speaking of scarves, it's fall again. Get your bus or bike scarves at the newly revamped overheadwire.com. We are sold out of the bike-only heavyweight scarves, but let me know if you're still interested, and we'll consider ordering a new batch as well as coming up with our next design. If you have ideas, let me know, but I'm thinking about a tram or a train theme incoming. We've also discounted the lightweight bike scarves as well, so if you want one of those for your Zoom call wall or as a fashion statement that keeps the wind and sun off your neck, check those green bike lane checkerboard beauties out as well. At the website, you'll find scarves, sign up for the newsletter, get links to all of our various merch, including Bookshop, Book Club books, and the Cars Are Cholesterol merch at TeePublic, as well as our audiobook version of Town Planning and Practice by Raymond Unwin. We've also got an awesome new search feature for subscribers of the newsletter, so you can access all 100,000 plus items in the Newslink archive. Sign up for a free 2-week trial at theoverheadwire.com and you get access to that. And to be sure to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, as we're starting to post some of our Monday shows there when you see my audio face. So check that out if you get a chance. And now let's listen to this great show produced in partnership with Impact.
Hello, welcome. My name is Julie Eaton Ernst. I'm HNTB's National Climate Resilience Practice Leader, and I'm thrilled to be here today with Cris Liban. And we are excited today to talk to you about climate resilience, transit, sustainability, the intersection of all of the above. Cris, do you want to give a quick introduction, your bio, and how you've come to this world of sustainability, resilience, and transit?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Julie, and thanks for having me here, to HNTB and to Impact for inviting us to tell a little bit about our story here in the Los Angeles County Metropolitan Transportation Authority. We're the second or third largest transportation agency in the whole country, depending on what metric you use. I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer here in the organization. As the Chief Sustainability Officer, I have responsibility for climate, resiliency, sustainability actions. We have a strategic plan that has over 180 initiatives and efforts here in the organization. And we're really proud of this program. We've been doing this since 2007, and I'm hoping that we could touch a little bit about of everything that we're doing. The great things that are happening here in Los Angeles that hopefully will resonate with many parts of your listeners, cities and counties, and hopefully we can be helpful with that information.
Thanks, Cris. Wow, 180 initiatives is incredible. That's definitely a lot, and something I want to ask more questions about, because I think it was fun to see what those look like. And 2007, that is so much of this world. When we were talking about climate, resilience, sustainability, it feels so new, but 2007, you guys have been doing this for 15 years now, right? Is that about right?
17 years, actually. 17 years this month.
I got the COVID brain of I just have lost time.
No, don't worry about it. 2 years is not too bad and not too far off.
One of the things I'm curious to hear to start our conversation is when we hear climate, we hear resilience, we hear sustainability, there's a lot of language that comes into that, and people often have their own idea of what that means. And so I'd love to hear from you in your own words, when we're talking about climate or resilience or sustainability, what does that mean to you personally? How do you identify with those words?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I hail from the Philippines. I grew up there in an emerging economy. Out there in Asia, we have been taught by our parents, everything that's on the plate, do not waste anything because everything is so expensive. I also grew up in a country where we grew up in a dictatorship, and that has really set up our mindset towards what freedom is and what that really means in terms of what we can do, the innovation that one can aspire for and live with and work through those challenges to become the best you can be. I moved here when I was in the late teenage years but went back to the Philippines and finished my college over there, but started working over here. It was a very interesting journey because I didn't really intend to land in the environmental field. When I graduated, I actually was looking for work in the oil fields, in the oil industry and in the mining industry. And that was something that was on top of my mind while I was studying with my geology degree in the University of the Philippines. And the rationale for all of that was to make the Philippines the greatest country in the world economically, to discover the most lucrative mine field, to be part of the discovery of the deepest oil reserves that I can find. That was like the goal in life. But economics, personal economics essentially came through. And when I graduated, I remember a barrel of oil being something like $15, $17 per barrel. And there was really no job for a geologist. And this was in 1989 when I graduated. And I was looking at many ads on the paper. There's really no internet to look at and to look into. You have to write your application letter to these different companies. And I think after 50, 200 rejection letters, my dad came home one day and he said, I was reading something in the office and there was this magazine and there's this company that's looking for environmental specialists. And I'm like, what is that? And I think it was history. The proverbial was history from there. I became a traditional environmental specialist looking at how to remediate, as with many other stories of people who are now in this field, to clean up sites. So it was literally a 180, right? From what we now know as essentially strip mining or removing minerals from the earth and a lot of that pollution to now becoming this person who actually would preserve and protect the environment. While the job was different from what I thought, it was not too far away from the values that I grew up with of conserving, of living with the earth, eating what you grow, that kind of stuff. And it was an interesting journey by itself, from that first day of being an environmental specialist to where I am right now, and the evolution of after 10 years of being a consultant. I didn't really want to, and nothing about private consulting. I didn't see the journey for me to retire as a private consultant. I thought it was more fulfilling, personally fulfilling, to actually be in government and be an owner of assets and allow for me to work through and making a difference that way. From a very successful consulting career, I did turn my back against that and started out on the bottom of our organization here. I've been here for 21 years here in LA Metro, the longest I've been in any organization. And in all those 21 years, I started from the bottom here in the organization to where I am right now. And between where I started to where I am right now, there are, I think, around 10 different steps. 6 or 7 of those steps did not exist when I started here. So it was not only a trailblazing journey, but also a way for, I think, this organization, our industry in transportation, and for us to be able to recognize the importance of having, a very robust, holistic worldview, and not only environmental compliance and protection and stewardship, but allowing for other factors such as social justice, such as economic common sense, such as including the multiple facets of emerging issues relative to climate and how that impacts our lives and our infrastructure. A recognition of that has been, I think, reflective of how our organization here has created 7 positions beyond what was an endpoint before when I started here, creating 7 positions up to executive level. A recognition of all of that make a difference in the lives of 10 million people here in Los Angeles. And I'll end by saying that in the course of the last 17 years, we have evolved as well in terms of our strategies. We started out with just looking at how climate actually is affecting our situation here in the agency, to looking at energy conservation, and then also looking at other policy initiatives. Very simple thought, trying to just figure out what climate change meant to us, to now having this very robust consideration of environmental justice. That's been the hallmark of this program from the get-go. But now it's more visible thanks to all the advocacies and the conversations happening around the country, and then allowing for the common sense approach to actually make us more successful, having revenues generated, and for those revenues that we generate from our programs to be reinvested back into the infrastructures that we build here. And then one final note in that one, we do not forget that people are part of the conversation as well. There is nothing about the things that we do without thinking about the people that are affected. And that's an integral part of the conversation here. And so the programs really stem from youth all the way out to the aging population, and considering all of those in the outcomes that we're aspiring for.
Thanks, Cris. That's an incredible journey from extracting from the environment to protecting and stewarding and thinking about how at the end of the day, those roots of just the simplicity of being mindful, finishing what's on your plate, community are still a hallmark of your career and your approach to this. And I think one of the things that you mentioned, that common sense approach and having people be a part of it, I think is something that many of us resonate with, and thinking about, okay, what do we really need to do here? What are we talking about with our climate crisis? And what does that mean in the sense of, at the end of the day, transportation is inherently human.
Yep.
It's how we move, it's how we interact, it's how we get to our loved ones. And it's incredibly vulnerable when we're looking at these extreme weather events and climate change. And I think for me, as I first approached resilience without knowing that was the word, when I was at Tulane University, starting off as a freshman, when Hurricane Katrina rolled in, and the role of transportation in getting everybody out, like that sort of movement. If you take transportation for granted, and people, my dad stole the rental car because we were there dropping me off for college, but buses didn't come, and just seeing the impact of the transportation system on this, you realize just how important it is, both in evacuation and response and recovery. And it all gets down to the human element. So the other part of transportation too is that it's playing a role in causing a lot of these challenges, right? We've identified that it's the largest source of emissions, the transportation sector in the US. And I know that this is something that you've looked at locally with LA Metro, but you are also the lead author of the transportation chapter of the 5th National Climate Assessment. And so I'm wondering if there is, from what you've seen locally with LA Metro, nationally as part of this larger thought leadership, what are some of the key messages that sort of you take forth for what the transit community is looking at when it comes to the climate crisis in terms of solutions and challenges?
That's a great question. And those are really great points, Julie, in terms of your personal experience as well. And I'll answer your question this way. I'm a transit rider. I'm a transit rider who has a choice. I can either drive my car, I can afford to put fuel in that car, but I chose to take transit. I chose to experience that with the more than 70% of our transit-dependent population here in Los Angeles. And for me to better understand not only the struggles of people, but to better understand how to improve the transportation system that I'm a big part of, a product that I espouse for, that I work with my colleagues, the great colleagues here, 11,000 strong here in LA Metro, that we try to keep on time and reliable, try to keep safe, try to keep clean, and at the same time allowing for economic upliftment of the whole community and reducing burdens as a result in many parts of our county. And whatever those burdens are, we don't have time to talk about this, but we know what those are. I start the answer that way because I did mention earlier that I was trained as a scientist, but in my graduate degrees, I trained as an engineer. And as an engineer, you tend to offer solutions compared to as a scientist, you're trained to ask the questions, right?
Yeah, to diagnose the problem,
exactly.
Right? Scientists diagnose, the engineers solve. It's that like
Exactly.
combo.
So sometimes I feel like I'm schizophrenic in a way. I'm asking the question, but at the same time, I'm trying to answer the question. It's in a good way that's very fulfilling as well, because again, going back to your question on what I've seen and what's in store and how do we like reconcile these experiences locally to what people might be thinking nationally. There's really no fundamental difference, I think, at least from what I'm seeing the issues are. You did mention the National Climate Assessment that came out back in the fall, and President Biden rolled it out in November last year. And we're so happy to actually see the White House roll it out. We were there in Washington, D.C. to get that through. And there were 4 key messages in the transportation chapter. I just want to touch on, and then maybe this is the coming back to the local part, that climate is real, right? Climate impacts are real, and that there are multiple issues that are human caused. But what we found out during that assessment is that the risks of climate are essentially getting reduced because of the strategies and the solutions that we humans have come about in realizing the climate crisis. So that's the first part of that. The second part of our assessment included this discovery, actually, of the evolution of the definition of transportation. Transportation traditionally has been linked to, it's about buses and trains and airplanes and ships and boats and active transportation, bicycling and those types of modes, and walking, right? But what we've discovered as well is that because of the technologies that we've produced over the course of many years, people are now talking about not only those, but the internet, the delivery of information. Pipelines has always been part of the transportation definition, at least for us here locally. But people may not necessarily realize that pipeline distribution is also part of the transportation paradigm. And because of this redefinition, or at least the awareness on this new definition of transportation, we need to, as transportation professionals, actually think a little bit differently, not only because of what we've seen during the pandemic, this Black Swan event, and how to become more resilient so that Black Swan events like that won't affect us economically and socially and in a significant way as we've seen it. So we need to rethink about how we plan, how we construct, we operate, maintain, and procure for these systems. So that's the second message there. There's also the third message, where we need to think about the co-benefits other than clean air of transportation, that there are also co-benefits that we may not be necessarily thinking about. The health benefits indoors, for example, reduce carbon dioxide because of the reduced carbon dioxide outside and also inside homes. And we have a graphic in there where we outline what could be and how policymakers should be rethinking about the co-benefits of transportation. But more importantly, I think, is the fourth key message in there, that despite all the conversation about the technologies, the zero emissions vehicles that we might be producing, that all the great discoveries and achievements that we've seen in the clean tech revolution, there are unintended consequences around the world that we here in the United States, in this great economy, in this great country of ours, that we don't normally see and are not aware of, and we point out to those unintended consequences of mining for these battery
Batteries,
components
yeah.
in those minerals, the unintended consequences of, we have one co-author, for example, wherein they essentially have lived in the Alaskan region for a while. That's where she grew up, and they used to be able to go across this tundra from their house to the hospital. And now there's not, the permafrost is gone. It's now a big lake, and it takes a few hours to actually go from their house to the hospital now. And also these other unintended consequences of the end of life disposition of materials that we use. Where does that go, and how does that affect the ecosystems that we hold dear and hold to protect, so that we'll have green space in many of our communities? So those are the kinds of things. And I think that last one really resonated in many of the public meetings that I've gone to. That last key message really resonated well with the audience, that, wow, we have not necessarily thought of those. They have been meaning to talk about it, but us bring those things out in the open not only spurred conversation, but made people that I've talked to in the last almost year about this assessment really assess the strategies that they have long sought to implement, but now with the unintended consequences of those strategies as part of the equation, are now not rethinking, but making sure that, especially in overburdened communities, not only here in the United States, but anywhere else in the world, that those overburdened communities would not continue to be overburdened for the benefit of the few.
Yeah, I love that whole approach to it, because it seems like the sort of key messages are starting with the climate change is here. We are seeing the effects. It is very real, but it's not the only thing changing. So is transportation. So is the nature of the world. We've seen the Black Swan COVID event. There's a lot of change. We've seen success. We've been able to see, yes, we can do something. We are not helpless. We are competent, capable people that can work to tackle this crisis that feels very big, but we can take actionable steps to see that meaningful change. But with all of that, we're going to learn new things. And I think that's some of the, oh, yes, we might make an improvement here, but it could cost us somewhere else. And having that mindset of, it's not just we're done, I gave the solution, we're it, but really thinking through a life cycle approach, which is, I think, such the unique part about the climate resilience and sustainability concept, is thinking about how something is going to evolve over time, not just we're done, we did our capital project, it's over. Really interesting nuance that is starting to be promoted. And at the end of the day is going to have to be rooted in those communities where it is founded, because it will live on in those communities. And I think part of that, I think the part for me with the human element that always comes to talking about climate crisis and impacts, I immediately can visualize what's going to be on the news. There's a hurricane or a wildfire, right? There's some visually catastrophic event. Heat is an area that is really hard to visualize, but is so dangerous from a perspective of, there's the impacts to transportation infrastructure, our buses, our overhead catenary system, and our operations. But at the end of the day, the human health impacts are really staggering. And so do you see, as part of these opportunities, are you seeing anything with that common sense approach or community-based solutions that have been effective in having these conversations about heat when it's hard? There's not some impressive rendering, right, that we can roll out, but it's something very personal and incredibly disproportionate impacts on those overburdened communities.
Yeah, those are really great points. And especially the last point, that it's what we don't see that actually could make a significant impact in our lives. This is top of mind for us here in the organization, for me here in our agency, and for my work here. We have been coordinating with multiple stakeholders on several fronts. And what are those, right? So I'll give you some concrete examples. of what those are. The first one is we've had campaigns, for example, with our local university, UCLA, on just creating awareness on heat and what that really means to our citizens here, especially those who are waiting at bus stops in summer, especially. Heat is throughout the year, obviously, but especially during summertime, it's more intense. And in certain times of the year, it also is intense. I did mention earlier that I'm a transit rider, and that's really part of what I assess. I want to make sure that I understand how it feels to be in a certain coverage of canopy and how we can make improvements on our canopy design, what amenities might be added on in addition to the typical conversation of, oh, we don't have a bus shelter here, or wow, this bench is hot because of the color that has been painted on it, right? That kind of thing. We have also been working on initiatives relative to bus stops in the last few years. Through customer experience surveys, we have been identifying many of the challenges that not only our transit riders, but me on a personal note again, are experiencing and are putting our minds on how to reduce those. We don't own the sidewalk.
Exactly. It's
We
always a problem of where the jurisdiction ends, right?
Exactly. We don't own the sidewalk. The cities own the sidewalk. We own where the pole is on the sidewalk. We own the pole itself, and we own the sign. But what we have been doing, though, is that there is now at least a rudimentary website that people can visit in terms of what resources are available to cities, especially those who don't have resources to reimagine bus stops. That rudimentary website is being upgraded to a tool that cities can actually use for their design, as well as, again, the rethinking of these bus stops. And we have engaged as well with community-based organizations. Last April, for example, we have partnered up with an organization called Pando Days and Homeboy Industries in here. For your listeners who don't know, Homeboy Industries, that's essentially a nonprofit organization where their goal is to essentially bring former gang members into productive states of the community. And they employ them, they create businesses for former gang members under the direction of Father Greg Boyle to actually immerse and, again, become productive members of our community. Going back to the bus stop conversation, what we did with Pando Days, another nonprofit organization, and Homeboy Industries, is we essentially held Camp Pando, wherein we have a little bit over a dozen at-risk youth. We paired them up with the best designers that we can get our hands on. These are from Harvard or from up in Northern California, and from some number of designers here in Los Angeles. We paired the at-risk youth with these designers. We deployed them across the city, across the region, in many different bus stop locations. And they came up with ideas on how to create amenities to reduce impacts of heat. And it's quite an interesting exercise because, for the most part, again, this is a direct input from most likely transit-dependent youth, and for us to allow to have an insight in those. And we're in the process of exploring how to implement that. And I think the other part there is that we also have been engaging. I did mention about tools and tools development. We've engaged with from our sustainability office here. I've been engaging for many years with our customer experience group, with our safety and security team, and all of the other partners here in the region to make an assessment at each one of our bus stop locations, at each one of our stations, and allow for any changes in either the design criteria. Are there opportunities for applying for grants, for example? Are there opportunities for piggybacking on existing programs, working together with advertising companies, and allowing for those changes to happen? One final note I wanted to mention that we haven't touched in here: infrastructure is built on the backs of laborers, and laborers are out there and they experience a significant amount of these heat stressors that we're talking about in here. There have been a lot of conversations, not only with the unions, but also with the construction community, on how to address those kinds of issues. And we're working towards strategies to reduce those impacts. One thing I just wanted to mention, going back to the Philippines, the Philippine Department of Transportation visited us here a month and a half ago, and that was back in July. And it was an interesting visit because we've never really had a visit from the Philippines and much less government officials from the Philippines. And part of what what I discovered preparation for that meeting was the Philippines being as hot as it is, if not the first, one of the first countries in the world to actually have a legislation to allow for workers who are working outside to have more breaks, to have more amenities, so that heat impact on those workers are reduced. An emerging economy, a developing nation caring for its people. And I just said, wow, that's something we can learn from. And here in Los Angeles, we have a lot of transit-dependent populations, overburdened communities, laborers because of our infrastructure programs. I think it's really time for us to take this more seriously. I'm not saying we're not, but take it more seriously and learn from countries like the Philippines on how that would work.
I think I'm so glad that you brought that up, because that is an area. I think the EPA released this summer some pretty staggering effects of heat, and the construction industry had by and far the most heat-related deaths. And it's really scary because you shouldn't go to your work and be afraid you're going to die or be impacted. And being able to look at that and seeing the new OSHA discussions we're seeing at a national level. I think Maryland has just proposed their own requirements for outdoor labor as well, really pushing forward solutions that keep people safe so that we can continue to build and operate our infrastructure to keep our transportation reliable, on time, safe. I'm also really glad that you brought up that incredible example of re-envisioning bus stops in the community, because to me, it really hit on that point of co-benefits, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's more than just improving our air quality,
Yep.
but you're talking about giving people a say in what their environment looks like,
Yep.
Bringing together folks that have been potentially outcast from their community and reintegrating them into setting what that vision can look like, making sure that we're thinking about accessibility, safety on top of heat. Is really a wonderful way of, there's so much opportunity that by looking at this crisis, yes, we are in a situation where we have to do something about the climate. We have to make change, but that change can have so much more impact and really improve. And so I'm wondering, as you see implementing plans forward, you've gone through 17 years now of developing a plan, implementing a plan, growing that plan, 180 initiatives. What have you seen in that evolution, that if you could tell folks in the impact community of, hey, if you're just starting out, I wish somebody would have told me this, or this is what you have to look forward to, in both good and cautionary tales, if there's anything you'd want to share.
Yeah. That's a really fascinating question, to be candid, because I've been asked about that many times. Oh, you guys are the third largest transit agency in the country, $8-9 billion in budget. We have all this money coming in the next 40 years and beyond. Of course, you can do all that stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm like, let's step back for a second. In terms of the evolution, there really was nothing to copy, right? Back in 2007, there was a lot of conversation about climate. And I still have the list. We had 32 unfunded mandates that our board members gave me. No funding.
No money.
No funding. 20 volunteers. And I'll just say this matter of factly, when we convened a group of people in leadership positions here, 90% of them walked out because they had nothing to do with what they were hearing. And for the most part, I think that was a good thing that we have experienced that challenge, because creating that visibility and the wins, no matter how small, really helped not only prop up the program, but for us to be able to create this awareness of the importance of a program like this, not necessarily for this agency in particular, but for the people that we serve. And I think if the framing is like that, that this is really for our customers, this is really for those transit-dependent populations, this is really for those communities, and for them to somewhat become part of the conversation of the strategies, then we will have a bigger win, right? Not just a better win, but a bigger win. And I'm starting out the answer that way because with the 32 initiatives, unfunded mandates, 20 volunteers, the visibility and just trying to win over people to not only become aware, but get the importance of what we're trying to do. That took at least 5 years. And one of my mentors, he passed away already, Mr. Krishnamurthy, he sat me down one day and he said, Cris, you could think about the greatest things that you could think about in your life, but without sustainable source of funding, it's just that. If you're dependent on something that would trickle in terms of funding, then it's just that. And so we took this after 5 years of creating that visibility and having some success to it. We created this framework of how do we actually try to self-fund these programs? How do we create revenue so that we can, reinvest it back to these programs? And then after doing that, how do we now re-envision more success to the program? So in 2014, we looked at different alternative forms of funding and financing. They were still emerging back then. I think we're really fortunate to be living here in California, to have a carbon credits market in here and for us to be able to participate in that. But we also looked at other opportunities of advanced mitigation, other opportunities of reinvesting back the dollars that we don't spend as we conserve energy, conserve water, being really smart on where we buy things, having a sustainable acquisition program that was originally benchmarked from the Vancouver Olympics and allowing for us to learn from that experience up in Canada. That was very purposeful for us because we didn't really have, again, any template to draw from. And that was the best example that we can get our hands on in terms of what makes sense to us as an agency, as an organization. And for us now to actually work through these strategies and making adjustments along the way. I haven't mentioned this yet, but underlying all of these work is an environmental management system. And I apologize for those who don't know what that is. But at the heart of our program here is an environmental management system based on ISO 14001. And at the heart of that framework is this thinking of continual improvement. We cannot be perfect, but we need to be looking at the root cause of issues, documenting the strategies to reduce those root causes, and then doing something about it and learning from whatever the solutions are that we came up with and strategies we came up, learning from that and continually improve. That framework has really set up not only the continuing and very wise use of limited financial resources, incorporating the human element into this, allowing for us to adjust with the different underlying assumptions in terms of our design because of all these climate changes and empirical information that we're looking at, but also looking at the methods and how we could improve our system and our programs better and allow for those improvements to better create opportunities for people.
I hear so much of the scientist and engineer dance of the continually diagnosing, solving, improving. And I think that it's just incredible to have that as that root behind all of this work and be bringing in the community. I think that's wonderful guidance and advice and insight, even for me to hear. I'm like, oh, this is really helpful. I know we're wrapping up on time. And I always like to ask, as you're looking out into the future, what is giving you a lot of hope as you're moving towards those 180 initiatives? There is the Olympics coming up. There's so much, right? And what on top of the climate world, what gives you hope and what are you excited to see that if we had this conversation 5 years from now,
Yep.
what would you hope would be a part of it?
I think it's beyond hope, right? One can aspire, one can really work through, one can ensure their own destiny. Our future's in our hands. I grew up with that mindset. I lived in a world when I was growing up when freedoms are repressed. We cannot say things that we wanted to say. And coming here in this country and adopting it as my country really makes not only my life and the differences that we make here fulfilling, seeing the difference in these programs and how these programs make a difference in people's lives. That's indescribable. And then going back, Julie, to your question, as I was saying the things that, and how we evolved from where we were back in 2007 to where we are, no small achievement could be too small because we're a community of millions of people. And wherever you are in the country and wherever you are in the world, you're a community of people, right? And so collectively, no small achievement could be too small. And people should reflect on that. We should reflect on that statement that, oh, wow, what does turning off the light switch, how could that make a difference? What does, example earlier, eating the last 5 grains of rice on the plate, how could that make a difference? A lot. And especially if one has grown in a situation where you don't really have any money to begin with, where you're struggling, as I was, that collectively, 5 grains of rice, eating that versus wasting it, that could be a lot of dollars in the long run.
I'll add there, one of the favorite things, one of my daughter's favorite books, there's a quote of, no one person can do everything, but everyone can do something.
Yes.
And I think that sort of approach of collective, together we can and we will, it is indescribable when you see it and you see the power of it with communities that might not have resources individually, but when we pull them together, we can move mountains.
And I'll just end by saying that, at least on this question, by saying that 5 years from now, you ask that question, what's the hope? We're all human beings. We have our own desires and our own goals in our lives. And no matter how small or how big those are, collectively, we live in one planet, right? And thinking about that concept of, we're human beings. We live in one planet. I'll end this part of the question by saying that I remember my first week here in the United States, and I walked around our neighborhood and where we lived, and people were like, oh, hi, good morning. And people were just greeting you, right? And if I had a difference in opinion, this was my first week or two here. If we have differences in opinion, we just bantered and debated about it. Honestly, I miss those days when I could just be myself. I'm not afraid to tell people who I am. I still am not afraid to tell people who I am and what my thoughts are. But at the same time, we are living in a world that sees a challenge, a crisis even. And we need to think about the different solutions and strategies. And maybe those ideas that we don't agree with, there's value in just listening to those ideas and shaping what we actually think are the strategies that people need to be doing. And that's a shift in the framework of recent memory, wherein people debate, and if it doesn't conform to what they're thinking, it may not be good enough. So I'm hoping that in the foreseeable future, we go back to that state of we just listen. And that's a very hard skill to learn because we just want to talk and we just want to advance our own ideas, which is not bad. But at the same time, as we've been talking collectively, we live in this one place, and no better way of living in this one place than working together to resolve our issues.
Very well said, Cris. And I agree. I think being able to listen, understand perspectives, and lived experiences is a powerful way to make those connections that we need to be able to make the change that we want to see, build the future that we want to have for ourselves, for our children, for our pets, for our loved ones, and really have that community. So I think this is a time that we have today. I just want to thank you so much for listening to this Impact podcast with Cris Liban from LA Metro. Cris, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and insight with us. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of the Overhead Wire and appears first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our generous Patreon supporters for supporting this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Sign up for our 18-year-old daily newsletter by visiting theoverheadwire.com or check the show notes for other cool merch and opportunities to connect. Follow along using your podcatcher of choice, but if you can't find it there, you can always find the show at its original home, usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.